Everyone. I hope everyone can hear me, especially the online audience. Thank you so much for joining us. And we are really glad that you are here, both in person and everyone who is joining us online. Thank you very much. We are delighted that for the second seminar of the HSC India Club, we have combined this event with the India Week that the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs is marking throughout so this week and the coming week, we have combined the events that will form part of the India Week at the High School of Economics. We are delighted that Mr. Nandan Unnikrishnan, who is a distinguished fellow at a leading Indian think tank, Observer Research Foundation, could join us. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. First of all, may I request Professor Alexander Lukin, who is head of the School of International Affairs and also heads the International Laboratory on World Order Studies and New Regionalism, to make the introductory remarks. Please.
Thank you. It's my great honor and pleasure at the same time to introduce my good friend and also good friend of the entire Russian people, Nandan Unnikrishnan, who is certainly the best Indian expert on Russia. And by the way, he speaks Russian just like I do. I'm not sure why he prefers to speak English. Maybe it's just to educate you in the English language. But he's actually a Muscovite because he went to school in Moscow, somewhere near Arbat, was it? Yes, and he got this nice Russian language. I picked nice Russian language from there. And he's a very well-known person in India and in Russia. He graduated from Nehru University. He was a journalist of PTI agency, is the largest agency in India, and later worked with Observer Research Foundation, which is one of the most important Indian think tanks, working on, I think, it's international relations mostly, and that's it has a lot of events every year. I think I took part in some of them in India, and it was looked very important and effective. And he was vice president, and now he's a distinguished fellow there. And it's an important talk, especially now, because, not many people from the other side of the world come to us these days. In some countries, actually, I know it for sure, it's actually banned to deal with Russian academia. For example, I got such a letter from Czech Republic and from Italy. But India, of course, is a very good friend of us, and it has always been an important country, and now it's one of the most important countries as a political partner and more as an economic partner. So I think Nandan is going to talk about it now, and how we can deepen our cooperation in this serious international situation that we are living in. Thank you very much, Nandan.
Thank you, Alexander, for those kind words. I can only add that I was a vice president, that's true. I'm now a distinguished fellow, which is the last phase before being extinguished. So I'm well headed on the way to being then extinguished after that. So you will forgive me that I will be talking. Firstly, of course, I have to thank the HSC and the club for inviting me to speak. I actually was very keen to participate in this discussion, and that is what I view it as. This is not a lecture, as Alexander has said, but this is just, I view it as a discussion, because the vastness of the topic is such that I doubt, I definitely cannot, I can speak for myself, I doubt that I understand even 30% of the processes that are taking place in this area. So to make life easier for myself, I am going to stick to trying to explain primarily to myself what is India's view of Eurasia. And once I get through that, hopefully in about 20 minutes, then we will speak for about 10 minutes about, or I will speak about India-Russia relations in that context. So let me start without further ado. Let me start by talking about India and Eurasia. We have to understand that ever since independence, India has always viewed itself as a great power. Its mentality internally has been of a great power. It does not have the capacity of a great power, undoubtedly, but it tends to behave like it is one, and very often is facing the criticism of being a very preachy partner who doesn't understand many things, but nevertheless has a theory about it, which reminds me of myself and my scholarship. I don't understand half the things, but I obviously have a theory and opinion about it. So in that sense, I am reflective of Indian foreign policy. But from an Indian perspective at a more serious level, Eurasia is broken up into multiple components. Yes, of course, it is a vast landmass stretching from the ocean, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific and down to the south. But also an important component which everyone forgets, that landmass also stretches to the Arctic Ocean. And the Indians keep remembering that. I know sometimes Russia is not very happy about it, but nevertheless, we view that also as part of the Eurasian landmass. So these components, apart from the water bodies that surround it, well, to put it very simply, I would break it into Europe, and the borders of Europe would normally end with the western border of Ukraine. Now it will be somewhere inside Ukraine. The second area of importance would be Central Asia, I think. Then the third element that is emerging in this, which normally I would have said the most dominant country is Russia, but I would say now we are talking of the Eurasian Economic Union. That is a third element that has emerged. Of course, a dominant force in India's vision of Eurasia is China. And even if India wants to forget it, China doesn't let us forget it. And then at maybe, this is not in any particular order, I'm just going geographically. You have the ASEAN, you have a separate attitude and understanding of Japan and South Korea. And of course, something that is very, very important to India, which we in India call West Asia, but the rest of the world has different denominations. The West calls it the Middle East. The Russians call it Blizhny Vostok, Near East. So I suppose somebody should study the nomenclature that is used for this territory and try and understand why. The changes that are taking place in the Eurasian geopolitical space are also changing India's approaches to some of the partners that exist. Europe, till very recently, did not really occupy a significant space in India's foreign policy. Yes, it was important, but it was more important at a bilateral level. For example, we had a very robust relationship with France, which was both economic as well as security. We buy considerable amount of arms from France, and this has been a historical position. With Germany, it has been primarily an economic relationship. Germany is one of the larger partners with India. And Britain, of course, that time Britain was still part of the European Union, was another big partner of India. Central Europe, you know, Poland down to Romania, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, did not play any significant part in Indian foreign policy. But that is changing. And India is coming to the conclusion that Europe is going to be a significant field in which the geopolitical battle between the United States and China is going to play out. And India feels that with its great power ambitions, that it must be in this area. So if you look at Indian foreign policy for the last couple of years, you will see a lot of activity that has taken place in its relationship with the EU. You will also recently remember that the Prime Minister of India visited the EU just, I think, last month, this month, and met several European leaders and has repeatedly re-emphasized the need for India and Europe to engage. What were the reasons that India did not look at Europe very, well, let's say, with any great enthusiasm in the past? One of the primary reasons for that is that Europe did not play any security role. Europe did not have unified security policy, and India felt that it could not contribute to the evolving geopolitical game that was evolving in what India now calls the Indo-Pacific, in the region of the Indo-Pacific. Just as a matter of speculation, is this relationship likely to develop and what are its prospects? I personally think that the economic level, the prospects of the relationship with Europe are significant. I think India's relationship with Europe is going to grow significantly. And this is positive. But I also think India is hoping that Europe starts paying more for its own security, not because it wants Europe to play a very big security role in the Indo-Pacific, but it is hoping that if Europe looks after its defense, then at least the Americans won't be distracted and the Americans will come into the Indo-Pacific with a greater amount of energy. The next area that I will look at is India's relationship with, actually let me do it the other way around. Let me go with the smaller parts first. India's relationship with ASEAN also started recently. It is something that started in the mid-90s, really. We've had a relationship. Again, all these relationships were bilateral, strong relationships with Malaysia, Singapore. But it is in the 90s, particularly after India's liberal reforms, liberal economic reforms, when the Indian economy opened up, that India understood the importance of engaging with ASEAN, which was an economic powerhouse in the region. And that relationship has got enhanced significantly in the last 20 years. And it is also important because the concept of the Indo-Pacific, which was rejected by many, including the ASEAN in the beginning, but today, if you look at it, the ASEAN is coming around to accepting that such a concept is useful and that they are probably willing to accept being part of it. But of course, they feel that there should be ASEAN centrality in this, which is a natural feeling, as it were, that I would ascribe to countries of the ASEAN. But you will see engagement with India increasing, even in security terms, with the ASEAN countries, whether it is with Indonesia, whether it is with Singapore, and now particularly Vietnam, for example, or even the Philippines. India recently sold some military hardware to the Philippines, which was earlier unthinkable. So you can see that India is beginning to recognize the importance of the ASEAN. And again, this is an area and a relationship that is likely to see significant growth. The third area that I will look at is Japan and South Korea. Japan has always had a very traditionally strong relationship with India. They have traditionally been a donor. They have also invested heavily in India's infrastructure. In fact, many of India's metro projects have been executed because of Japan. But again, till very recently, this was an economic relationship which was driven more by Japan than by India. Today, India, so you will find, for example, Japanese cars. Now, it's very interesting that Japan has actually contributed to a significant part of our industrialization by starting to produce the Suzuki car in collaboration with the government of India in the 80s. But around that Suzuki car, what has happened is an entire auto spares industry has cropped up. And today, India is one of the leading exporters of auto parts in the world. And when the success of Suzuki was seen across the globe, you find all countries, whether the Koreans were there, subsequently the Europeans, the Americans. So India's car industry today is probably on par with the car industries in any country. And I can't really think of any major international brand that is not represented with production within the country. I mean, even these fancy brands like Mercedes and all, they all produce their cars within India. So it all started with humble beginnings of a small Japanese 800cc car being produced in India. So small things can lead to big things sometimes, successfully. The next I will look at, and of course South Korea, South Korea also followed in those footsteps, and today South Korea is significantly engaged in India's economy, but not only in the car industry. South Korea is engaged in the telecom industry, not just in providing Samsung, but they also give us a lot of hardware for our telecom industry. And there is a huge potential to develop shipping links between, when I say shipping links, I don't mean that you send ships between India and South Korea, but that India and South Korea can engage in shipbuilding together. Then the large area that is left is the Middle East. Now, the Middle East has traditionally been of significant importance to India. If you look back in history, the British Raj, it used to run the Middle East, those areas that it controlled, out of Delhi. And just as a historical reference, till 1961, in some Middle Eastern countries, the rupee was a legal tender. It was accepted, for example, in Oman. But for a variety of reasons, India has lost those positions that it had in West Asia. it still maintains a very large diaspora. So the West Asians cannot forget India in that sense. We do buy a lot of oil from West Asia, but otherwise economic links were very, I would say, fragile. But recently, again, this has actually happened after the Modi government has come to power in 2014. There has been a significant improvement in relationship between India and the West Asian countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and also Israel. But Israel has been traditionally since the 90s an important partner because Israel has always acquired a certain security profile for India, so which is very important and which we cannot do without. But now the West Asian countries are acquiring a greater economic role because they are willing to invest into India's economy. And today India is, I will talk about the challenges that India faces a little later, and then you will understand why this is such an important issue. Since I'm going to talk about Russia and India later, I will not take time with that. And now I will come to the big elephant called China, or dragon, whichever you prefer. The Indo-Chinese relationship is a very complicated relationship. Both of us got our independence in the last years of the 1940s. We were in 47, China a little later. Initially, there was this spirit of Asian brotherhood, and both countries looked upon each other as partners, but both had enough problems and therefore did not really engage substantially with each other. However, somewhere in the mid-50s, a certain element of friction started coming in because, as usually done in these cases, when the colonial powers left, the border was left undemarcated, or rather it was demarcated by the British, but not enforced through any treaties. And so the Chinese had their own vision of the border. The Indians who took on borders or understanding of borders from the British had a different understanding of where the border lay. I'm not going to go into the history as to who is at fault and not at fault, but the fact is that this resulted in a very short, brutal war in 1962, in which the Chinese moved into Indian territory. They taught India what they thought was a lesson, and they withdrew. But they didn't withdraw from everywhere. There were some chunks of Indian territory, particularly on the western side of the border, western when you look from China, western side of the border, a place called Aksai Chin, which was taken. And although it is an area, it's a very large area, and famously was described as a place where not a blade of grass grows, but still it does have significant strategic importance because it overlooks the strategic Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. Despite that war, for many years, India still pursued a policy in which it sought to arrive at an understanding with China through negotiations on the border. It was a long, tortuous process, but by 2005, we had arrived, the two countries had arrived at a document which would have helped actually demarcate the entire border. It's almost 4,000, well, it varies, The Chinese count about 700 kilometers less than what we count as the border. But it would have helped to demarcate. But after that, suddenly there has been a certain change in the Chinese approach to the issue. And the Chinese have suggested that we should first build trust through increasing our trade and developing closer relationships in other fields. And then once this trust is developed, then the border could get resolved. That was something that India pursued, although repeatedly the Chinese did, particularly in the last, let's say, 10 to 12 years, the Chinese repeatedly made small incursions on the border, and which would lead to tense standoffs. But there wasn't any actual fighting. In fact, from 1962, barring one small incident in 1967, till 2020, not a single bullet was fired on that border. So by all criteria, it was, in theory, a peaceful border. But yet it was tense because you had these little incursions which would create a very tense situation, and then the Chinese would withdraw. However, in 2020, that situation changed. And once again, there was a Chinese incursion. And it led to a violent clash in which, officially at least, a dozen Indians were killed, 2 dozen, I think. And Chinese say that 4 Chinese were killed. This was the first time there were fatalities on the border since 1962, 67 actually, because there was a small incident in 67. And this has changed now India's attitude towards China. India's attitude has become far less tolerant. India has declared that unless China settles the border, we cannot go back to the business as usual mode. In other words, India is now rejecting the formula that was proposed by the Chinese earlier, and which India had accepted, that you build relations in all spheres, try and build trust, and then we can negotiate the thorny problem of the border. Now India is saying that we'll have to put that border up front. So the relationship with China today has become probably, in a sense, the most consequential security challenge that India faces. And it is not only about India's border. And the border is only one particular issue. It is also about the fact that China, like any great power should, with its economic growth, has also attempted to not just spread its economic growth, but also to spread its political influence across the globe. And that has come into South Asia too. And of course, India feels that, like any other exceptional nation, that South Asia is its own sphere of influence. And therefore, we are all hearing this term more and more often these days. But anyhow, and therefore, China's entry is not a welcome development. So there is this whole challenge that India feels that China presents, not just on the Indo-Chinese border, but across this whole area that is called the Indo-Pacific. And therefore, India has started its policy of seeking partners, external partners, not necessarily those who are part of the region, to deal with this challenge. Now that I've gone through Eurasia as sort of region-wise, let me try to bring this into context. What is India's primary challenge? I know people will say China, somebody will say something else and all, but all that is not really the, in my opinion, is not really the most important thing. India's primary challenge today is poverty. Even by the most conservative estimates, there are at least 400 million people who are below the line of poverty. And we are defining and going by defining poverty as $2. I mean, people who don't get $2 a day, so they are not able to feed themselves. In fact, there are some studies which have tried to do this, some students who have attempted to do this exercise and tried to live for a month or two on, well, about $2 a day. And nobody has succeeded. So you have 400 million people who somehow are managing. And so obviously this is a huge challenge because if this continues for much longer, the inequality and the discontent is bound to spill over. And that could create huge problems, not just within India. In fact, all this migration that Europe sees today will seem like a kindergarten if India explodes and millions start marching northwards, because they can't go southwards, that's the sea. So they will only have northwards to march. They can't go eastwards because the mountains are too high. So the only way is to go through Pakistan into Europe. So welcome to New India, Europe. That's all I can say. But anyhow, so the greatest challenge is poverty, and India's foreign policy today is geared towards meeting that challenge. And I think to some extent, it's a recognition by the political class that development is what the primary agenda is. So with the primary challenge of development, what India needs is peace on its borders at least, and it needs cooperation from the rest of the world in terms of finance, technology, and other resources that will help it in this task of development. There is a third challenge, which is climate change. And climate change is imposing on India because of the rest of the world. When we agree to all these Paris Accords and all these agreements that limit carbon emissions, basically what India is being asked to do is an experiment that no one has tried to do in the world. India is being asked to industrialize without using fossil fuels. Every other nation in history that we've seen that has industrialized has used fossil fuels to create the energy needed for that. India today has, I forget the figure, but I'm sure I can send it to you. But India's per capita consumption of electricity is probably amongst the lowest in the world. And India has to increase that several fold to be able to take these 400 million out of poverty. Even if you were to take only half of them out of poverty, you still need to significantly increase your energy output. And doing that without increasing your emissions is a practically impossible task. So this is a challenge that India will have to face. It is being imposed on India. And of course, the fourth, and this is a disruptive challenge, and the fourth challenge that India faces is, apart from the security, economy and all, is technology. Today we are going through some people call it the fourth industrial revolution and all. But the point is, we have arrived at a disruptive stage in technology. And this technology, unlike others, is one which is actually going to make human beings redundant. I mean, human labor is it reminds me of the discussions on communism I used to have as a youth in my university, where we would say that, yes, this is what it will do, technology will take over and people will be free to engage with their creativity. They would not have to earn a salary. They will, start producing and you will have a tremendous burst of innovation, of art, of culture and everything. Unfortunately, that is not the future that is in front of India, because apart from poverty, we also have huge levels of illiteracy. We also have huge problems about access to healthcare and undeveloped infrastructure, even in terms of roads and connectivity. I'm painting a very poor image of India, but I'm doing that deliberately because I want you to understand that this poverty-stricken country is still being viewed by the rest of the world as a great power. This is not now India's delusion, which was there maybe in the 50s and the 60s. This is a shared delusion by the rest of the world. If you look at what the rest of the world is saying independently, they are expecting India to behave like a great power. So now you have to recognize that there are obviously either some changes that have taken place in what constitutes a great power. Because if I go by classical definitions of what constitutes a great power, yeah, population, area and all that, but all other capacities, India fails. India does not meet them. So it's something that is a question that bothers me greatly on whether India should actually aspire to this. I think if India concentrated on development and forgot about its great power ambitions, yes, the world will not stop for India to develop. I agree with that. But at the same time, if India grows even at the rate that it is growing today, which is not very significant. I'm talking of the COVID years. Even then, India in 5 years will become a $5 trillion economy. Even then, in 20 years, we will be probably a 15 to $20 trillion economy. Because India has that potential and it has reached what used to be referred to in the past, the Hindu growth of rate. The point is, each time, because we are now a $2 or $3 trillion economy, even if you grow at a minimal pace of 4 to 5%, you're going to, in the next period of time, you're going to double your numbers. So I understand why the rest of the world sees this potential in India. But the rest of the world should also understand the challenges that are there. And this brings me to the fundamental challenge. India's developmental projects require trillions of dollars. These trillions of dollars reside across the whole world. And India is not asking for these trillions of dollars as aid. India is happy to take on the challenges of climate change, of technology and all, provided these dollars are available even as loans, as commercial loans, which India will repay at standard interest rates. But the problem today is that and you see it particularly in Eurasia, where for some peculiar reason, geopolitics has started trumping geoeconomics. And very often, economic decisions are driven by political considerations. So, you know, I'm not sanguine about India's prospects, but I am hoping that sanity will prevail eventually, because a failed India project will be a disaster for the whole world, if you ask me. And now to the last 5 minutes, the India-Russia relationship. If India has great power ambitions, then India should be able to engage with all great powers. Nobody has become, I mean, I don't know of an example of any country emerging as a great power on the coattails of some other great power. So therefore, the chances of India becoming an ally of any other power, whether it is the United States, Russia, China, anybody, is minimal. As long as India retains its ambitions to be a great power, an independent, sovereign power, because it wants to be at the high table, this high table of decision making, just as Mr. Lukin is today the decision maker in this place. So India also wants to be at the same table. And for that to happen, India, of course, requires development, but India also has to understand that it cannot be in any alliance kind of relationships with partners. Yes, it will have closer relationships with people at times. For example, I'll give you the example of 1971, where we signed a peace treaty with peace and friendship treaty with the Soviet Union, in which we said we will consult each other if one or the other is attacked. And we used the treaty was used by India when India moved against East Pakistan. And it is Russia that, Soviet Union rather, that responded and prevented the United Nations from adopting resolutions that would label India an aggressor. The Soviet Union moved in even far more significantly by sending its navy into the Indian Ocean to prevent the American Navy from moving towards East Pakistan and the British Navy. So India has in many ways sometimes come closer to one power depending on the requirements. But at no point of time would anyone be able to say that India was a junior partner of the Soviet Union or was an ally of the Soviet Union, because we had humongous level of differences also. I mean, I can give you one difference is, let's say, the approach to NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There was major difference between India and Russia because India was pursuing the path of first openly and then clandestinely of getting nuclear weapons. And then it announced it in 1998 that we have nuclear weapons. The only thing the Soviet Union did, and then subsequently Russia continued, is that whenever India tested a device, while the rest of the world imposed sanctions, the Soviets and Russians did not impose sanctions on us. But the language of condemnation wasn't soft at all. So the point I'm making here is that if India wants to be a great power, it requires these relationships with all great powers, and therefore it is important for India to have a working relationship with Russia. It is even more important for India to have a working relationship with Russia because, in my opinion, that is the only thing that will prevent a new bipolarity from emerging. It will be a kind of a, it will make the difference of other great powers also being part of the game. You could call it multipolarity, maybe asymmetric or whatever. But the point is, you will not have the classic bipolarity of the Soviet Union versus the United States emerging. But for that, it is required that countries like Russia, India, and other great powers stay separate. Unfortunately, some of those who have these aspirations to be great powers already have alliance kind of relationships with other countries. Is this feasible given India's security and economic environment? It is difficult. It is very, very difficult because if you look at the economic picture, India's trade with Russia is about $10 billion. That's it. India's trade with the combined West is closer to $400 billion. So you can, you know, if this was physics and you have one body of 400 billion and another body of 10 billion, and there was one body in between, you can see where that body will gravitate. So it is going to be a humongously difficult challenge. There are reasons to maintain and continue seeking ways of developing this relationship so as not to allow each other to escape from each other's orbit. Both leaderships will have to be creative. They will have to learn not to spring surprises on each other, like some friends of ours did in February this year. These are not actions that would help the relationship. They bring multiple pressures on the relationship, because then one of the partners has to start navigating all kinds of underwater stones. And I mean this, it's not as if Russia will not have to navigate. Russia's relationship with China, if India does something equally provocative, will bring that relationship under stress. Again, Russia will have to start navigating underwater stones to maintain its relationship with India and the equilibrium it has with China. So therefore, I think this relationship has potential. We'll discuss in detail and during the question answer session. This relationship has potential, but the challenges that I foresee at this point of time are genuinely humongous. And I'm bringing this to a close at this point and hoping that I am answering the question that Alexander raised about deepening cooperation between the two countries. I am all for deepening cooperation, but I think we have to start thinking about it far more creatively. And we have to keep in mind two very important factors. One is the completely different structures of our economies. The Indian economy is 85% private. So India's GDP of $3 trillion, 85% of that is generated from the private sector. That is not the same for Russia. And the Indian private sector is practically not involved in the Indo-Russian relationship today. So if that continues, this relationship is doomed. So there has to be a creative approach to this as to how we can keep this relationship going. And I think it is important for Eurasia, because Eurasia, and seeing the changes that are taking place in Eurasia, we also have to remember that Eurasia is one place which has a huge number of hotspots, tensions. If you noticed, I didn't talk about South Asia at all, which is full of hotspots in itself. But Eurasia, I mean Asia particularly, has many hotspots. It has nuclear weapon powers, and it does not have a security architecture of any kind. It never has had. And I think that is a primary challenge for the region as a whole, that we need to come to terms with this and come to some kind of understanding and a security architecture that is acceptable to all of us. So there is a common challenge that we also all face. With this, thank you very much. I hope I didn't put you to sleep.
Thank you very much. Professor Kanaev wanted to say something. No, it's not a question. I think it's a comment and a praise.
In fact, it's a question. But before I ask my question, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to our distinguished speaker, who is, in my opinion, without any exaggeration, is one of the most insightful and brilliant Indian intellectuals. And we really appreciate this opportunity to have you here in this audience room. I'm speaking as a university professor, and I especially appreciate that you delivered your brilliant lecture without looking through your notes, or in Russian,
without even calling it a lecture.
And I have a question that goes to the Belt and Road Initiative. And as far as I'm informed, so far, India's attitude to this multilateral initiative has been negative owing to a variety of economic and political reasons. And without mentioning them all, my question is very simple. This ambiguity cannot last indefinitely, and sooner than later, India will have to do something about the Belt and Road Initiative, either to, well, accommodate its interests with what China offers, or to offer a counter initiative, or to do something else. And looking into the future, how do you see India's attitude to the Belt and Road Initiative? And is it possible for the Asian century to materialize? Is it possible for the Asian century to materialize with China and India being fierce opponents? Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah. I think, thank you. Firstly, I will thoroughly disagree with your kind words about me. But I think it's a genuinely great question. Some elements of it I do not have an answer for. But let me put it like this. At this point of time, India opposes the Belt and Road Initiative for what I would think 2-3 reasons. One is one aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative which comes through Pakistan is violative and is on territory that India considers disputed. India considers that to be its legitimate part of Kashmir, just as Pakistan thinks that India's part of Kashmir is theirs. But basically it's a disputed territory and that China should not have started a project of this kind through a disputed territory. That's point number one. Point number two, India understands that the BRI is not just an economic project, but also a political project. It is about extending Chinese political influence to other parts and other regions of the world. And that is something that India is already tense about and is not comfortable with. It is not about not letting China grow. It is about managing that growth so that it is not disruptive to the entire region and not disruptive in other regions either. Are there alternatives to the BRI, or is India being the dog in the manger? I think there are alternatives to the BRI. Alternatives in the sense that I don't think there is any one single alternative. In fact, there are many elements of the BRI which I think are good. But there is one significant factor that could help create some level or understanding, minimize the influence that the Chinese are seeking, which is the oft talked about North-South corridor. If that project fructifies, you will find that the North-South corridor will be utilized not only by India, but ASEAN countries and many others will utilize that corridor to reach their products, particularly to Europe, because it cuts down the time of delivery by more than 14 days to reach any part of Europe than send it even via the Suez Canal. There is a challenge there. It is not just about construction, but there is a challenge about commercial viability because you will need to take away at least 4 to 5% of the traffic that goes through the Suez Canal to make this commercially viable. And there are all uncertainties which are attached to Iran because it will run through Iran. And given the current relationship Iran has with the United States, there are a lot of uncertainties in that project. But is there alternatives possible? Yes, there is an alternative possible. The final point I'll make is that business is like water. It will find a hole. So if you ask me, and I'm now being utterly cynical, if you ask me if Indian businessmen find that they're going to make a neat profit if they send their goods via the BRI, they will find ways to send their goods via the BRI.
But you mentioned that India suffers from huge infrastructural deficiencies. Why not capitalize on the Belt and Road Initiative?
But if you look at the map of the Belt and Road, it very neatly avoids India.
I see. And this is the key point to take into consideration, right? The military side of things.
Absolutely. It doesn't touch India. So we all know why it is important for China to have the BRI.
So I also have a question. First of all, thank you very much for such interesting lecture. And I have not one, I have several questions. First of all, speaking about the Chinese-Indian War of 1962, for me is really interesting why India still does not publish archives devoted to this war, especially Dudley reports and very big mountain of documents concerning this war. This is the first question. Second question is the question devoted to the Indian challenge with China. Don't you think that the main problem in China-Indian relation laid on the field of the negative trade balance between India and China? And the third question devoted to the decision concerning the poverty in India. What is the way? What are the ways of Indian government to solve this problem? Is this problem connected with the lower castes, first of all? Because the people who suffered from poverty, first of all, belong to the lower castes. And how is Indian government going to solve this problem?
The first question is my question too. I ask the government all the time, why don't they publish those documents? I don't get an answer. So I cannot answer that question, why the government does not publish. I just hope they do. But all I can say is that an Australian journalist has written a book. So that is more or less based on some of the documents. So that is one option. But obviously it's an unsatisfactory option because the documents are there, they are in New Delhi, and I really don't understand why the government of India does not release them. So I'm...
The books forbidden to already some books published in Australia and in Austria, but it's not possible to...
Yeah, so basically what is happening is that the rest of the world can know the truth, but the Indians should not know. Which is why my question to my government is, why the hell aren't you letting these documents out? But anyhow, they are not. So, and this is not, it's interesting actually, this question from a different perspective. I would understand if a Congress government didn't do it, because it would point to the failure of a Congress leadership, right, which was in power at that time. But even subsequent opposition governments, and we've had an opposition government for the last 8 years, and it's a vehemently anti-Congress government. Even they don't publish it. So obviously there is something in that report that troubles the Indian elites as a whole.
But in the same time, in Indian press, there are a lot of articles which are authors of that are criticized the position of Nehru, his forward policy, and all his policy in the beginning of 60s.
True, I agree with you. Those articles are recent, more recent, because as people are finding out from reading documents and data which is available outside India, particularly people who study outside India, are questioning some of these moves by the Congress government and by Nehru personally. And but as I said, you see, making a judgment on that without seeing the entire body of documents available is very difficult. I can make a political judgment and say Nehru was wrong. I mean, that's easy. Sitting in 2022 to say that about 1962 is not an issue. But the point is, I would rather have a look at the documents as they exist and then come to an independent judgment about whether I want to blame anyone at all or not. The second thing is, I would take the, it's attributed to the Japanese, I hope it is, where the approach to the problem is that if there is a problem, don't fix the blame, fix the problem first. You can fix the blame later. So in the India-China relationship, I would tell the Chinese and the Indians, fix the problem. We can figure out who was wrong later. The historical humiliations can be dealt with at a later stage. Okay, China's negative trade balance. Yes, China, the negative trade balance does play a role, but it's not the most significant role. The problem in that we have is that China restricts access to its market for our goods. It restricts, for example, access to our pharmaceutical industry. It restricts access to some of our technology companies. So there is an unequal approach, whereas they want to be able to access our country, and yet they have a restricted. Now, I understand that this is not India specific. China has an overall policy, and this all falls within that policy. But the Indian government's reaction is that if we are allowing certain things, then you have to treat us on a reciprocal basis. So there are many issues, even with the approach to that the Chinese had originally proposed of let's trade, let's have greater cultural communication, and then that will build trust to solving the problem. But that is not necessarily working out properly. Finally, poverty and caste. I would not, I mean, one is you're absolutely right. Of course, caste is, the poorer caste will always be the poorer in society, because the poorer castes were a vast majority of society in India. Pre-independence and post-independence, the Brahmins were not a majority of the society, ever. I mean, they were a thin layer right on top, that's it. So, but today the problem of poverty is that you have even the top layer of Brahmins, many of them are poor. And this is, the level of poverty is such, despite years and years, decades of positive discrimination. There have been reservations in educational institutions. There have been reservations in government jobs, not in the private sector though, for what socially deprived sections, or basically for the lower castes, right? Many of them have been lifted. But so therefore it is not, in my opinion, the question of poverty is not necessarily purely a caste-driven issue. I think there is a poverty which is affecting a large number of people across the board, and it is exacerbated by the lack of education. So amongst those 400 million, when you have a larger population growing, younger people, the chances that they will get educated are also minimum. So, you know, you keep contributing to this pool of people who are uneducated, not healthy, don't have access to healthcare. Obviously, on $2 a day, how will you access healthcare? And don't have the facilities to utilize any kind of social lift that will take them up. The social lift that was found after 1990, the economic reforms, was that almost every percentage of growth of the GDP would take about 10 million people outside the line, above the line of poverty. So therefore, I mean, it is primitive, it should not be done, but very often in today's minds of people, the GDP growth rate is linked with lifting people out of poverty. So people want India to grow at 10% because they think that anything above 4% means that many more people being lifted out of poverty. So 2 points I'm making. One is, yes, the disruptive potential of technology, climate change are challenges that the government has to deal with, but it also has to deal with them in the context of trying to provide livelihood to these people. What is the method of that livelihood? Maybe India should consider universal income. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not an economist, so I don't have a solution to this. But essentially, jobless growth is not an option anymore. India has been growing at 6-7% for the last decade, but that growth, while the GDP has been growing, has not been reflected in really a growth of jobs. So it is a challenge that this government has to deal with. They are trying, but so far they have not succeeded.
From my point of view, not solving the problem at all. It just keeps the problem as it is, because only few people from this castes have opportunity to get a good education and the post in the I don't know, in administrative post and so on. So the system reborn itself. It's not solve the problem.
I agree. I mean, I'm not suggesting that this is the most perfect solution. But the fact of the matter is, and I'll add one more, that what happens even in the system of positive discrimination is that those who have been uplifted and those who have now access to good education, good jobs, second and third generation people from lower castes who have risen, their children are usually the ones who misuse the system. So they are taking benefit and they should not be taking. Yeah, there are many problems with the system. But so far, I don't think anyone has come up with a better solution. Although to some extent I agree with your argument that the very existence of a positive discrimination mechanism actually recognizes the existence of discrimination and in some ways reinforces discrimination, because even if discrimination is not economic, it definitely continues socially. So if you want to remove discrimination, you would probably have to deal with it socially first. That's a question. Unfortunately, not my sphere of expertise.
Thank you very much for your lecture. It was interesting. And my question is the following. As far as I know, India is the second largest producer of crops. So are there any plans in India to increase its exports of crops to other countries that faced a shortage of wheat, or is India going to save it for internal consumption? Thank you.
Yeah, recently India announced a ban on exports of wheat, and the whole world has reacted very negatively to it. There were several considerations behind this decision. The primary consideration, yes, was protecting and making sure that prices don't rise within India. Because the temptation to export, because external prices are much higher, the temptation to export the temptation to export is very high, and therefore there was a worry that wheat would be diverted from India and go out because people would want to speculative practices of making money. That was one concern. The other concern was what was happening even abroad, was that some parties were acquiring the wheat and keeping it and artificially driving prices out and then putting it to the market. So what the government of India has said is that it understands that there is a humanitarian crisis in some areas, and it is willing to negotiate the supply of wheat or grains if this is a government-to-government request. So today India is conducting talks, I may have concluded talks, with several countries in the Middle East, with Egypt, all the countries which are most affected by whatever is happening in Ukraine.
Professor, first of all, thank you for your comprehensive lecture. We have a question from online from one of our students, Polina Volina, and she asked about the possibility. For example, as we see now, China and the United States government have better relations, has some burdens, and this is why the United States choose better relations with India. For example, if India continued to increasing the level of relations with Russia, will it lead to some situation when the United States government impose sanctions on India, and how India will handle with it? This is the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulina. That's a very interesting question, and this is at this point of time a mystery to everyone. Because what is the threshold at which the United States tolerance will end and sanctions begin, intolerance begins? I don't think there is any such positive, confident answer as to where this lies. But one thing is there, and that I think is what governs the understanding of the Indian government, is that if China is the main adversary of the United States, as declared by the United States itself, then there is no way any management of China's rise can be done in the Indo-Pacific region without India. So therefore, a strong India is something that is in the interests of the United States. And as long as whatever in the relationship with Russia, India does not weaken India in the perspective of the United States, it is something that the United States will tolerate. That is the understanding that I think is existing today in the minds of Indian policymakers. Of course, they will not unnecessarily try and do something with Russia which would definitely upset or irritate the Americans. But they will pursue whatever they think is in their national interest. And so therefore you have India buying the S-400 missile system. You have India leasing nuclear submarines from Russia. Now, again, let me point out that no other country in the world gives nuclear submarines to any other country. This is only so far in history. Yes, there is an AUKUS, but the AUKUS is still further down. But right now, only Russia does that with India. So there are multiple reasons why India needs Russia. And I don't think any rational person can say that whatever Russians are doing, for example, these two examples that I gave you, would lead to weakening India and would actually, after all, just if anybody, you don't have to be an Indian. Who is India going to use a nuclear submarine against? I don't think it's going to use it against the United States. It's not going to attack Russia. There's only one country that is likely to see the deployment in a hostile manner of an Indian nuclear submarine. That country also happens to be the main adversary of the United States. Now, why would the United States want to harm its own interest by sanctioning India for a purchase of a nuclear submarine? So I think, there is a lot of rhetoric that takes place, and there is also substantive action, and you have to learn to distinguish between the two. And particularly what comes out of Washington, 70% is usually rhetoric.
Thank you so much for your brilliant lecture. Brilliant as always. Could I ask you a stupid question, if possible?
I am stupid enough to answer.
Okay, so actually you mentioned that the greatest challenge for India today is not geopolitics, not all that stuff which is happening, but actually poverty, right? So actually the greatest challenge for Russia is an undiversified character of our economy, right? So that's also probably even more important than the geopolitical context. So my point that productive relationship is when you solve the problems of your friend and your friend solves the problems of you. So from your opinion, how Russia can help you with your greatest challenge, and how can India help Russia with its greatest challenge?
I agree with you that the greatest test of friendship is your ability to help each other in the problems you face. And I think to that extent, Russia is definitely doing it with India. For example, India is trying to diversify its arms purchases. When I say diversify may not be the proper word to use, because it is not about not buying a particular system from Russia, but buying it from the United States or somebody else. What India is trying to do is to get that system manufactured in India. And there are two reasons why that is done. One is no great power has become a great power on imported arms. So you need to develop a military industrial complex of your own. The second thing is that a military industrial complex of your own will also generate jobs, because it's the manufacturing sector that generates the maximum number of jobs so far. So therefore, Russia in that sense is part of that process. Once the sanctions on Russia were announced by the West, the government of India has instructed its oil companies to look at the possibility of greater investments in the Russian oil and gas sector. It has also asked, particularly its private sector, to look at some of the projects that they could probably execute in the Russian Far East, because that is also an area of interest, and there are other interests there also. So the problem, however, as I said, is that the investments can come through the government, but the second part of it will require the involvement of the private sector. And the Indian private sector, when I gave you the example of those two heavy bodies, the problem is that they are getting their 400 billion from that side. They're not getting it from here. So the private sector is, particularly the big private sector, is not likely to jeopardize their earnings from the West if they think that engagement with Russia is going to attract punitive actions. So what has to be done is that India has a very large small and medium industry sector, and India has experience in nurturing this. So one is the ability to engage these people, these sector enterprises in projects in Russia. And the second is that given the experience India has in nurturing small and medium-sized enterprises, this could be an experience or a learning that Russia could try and not copy, but adapt to its own purposes, because that would help a diversification of the economy away from state-maintained structures.
Thank you, sir. I was wondering if I could play a bit of a devil's advocate for the Indo-Russia relationship. So just a couple of days ago, Professor Habiman Jacob, who is another prominent Indian expert, he wrote saying, as a result of the ongoing war, Russia is no longer available as a strategic partner to India for the balancing act in its broader regions. And he thinks that no matter how the war ends, the regional balance of power would have shifted by the end of the war in favor of China. So do you agree with that assessment? And if that actually comes to pass, then would that impact the rationale of the Indo-Russia relationship in the Eurasian region, basically?
Happy Mohan is a very good friend of mine. But Happy Mohan is not someone who understands the Indo-Russian relationship. So I don't think he's the right example to give in this case. You have to look at another question first. What is Russia doing? I mean, I don't think the Russian leadership is trying to fight the Ukrainian leadership. I think the problem is entirely different. I think, in a sense, this is a proxy war with the Greater West, as it were, who had developed a particular model of governance of the world from 1945. And Russia is expressing its displeasure with that model. And Russia is saying that there have to be significant changes in that model. Yes, I mean, as an Indian, I cannot disagree with that fundamental premise. I disagree with war being used as a vehicle to reach what I want to reach. But the fact is that rewriting some of the rules of the world is something that many countries in the world aspire for. India is one of them. But I am asking a different question. What is Russia actually doing? Russia is declaring that it is not willing to play a secondary role to the West. Its project of integrating with the West is over because the West was not willing to treat Russia as an equal. Okay. Now, would you argue with me that, even as a devil's advocate, that Russia has decided it does not want to be a junior partner of the West because it wants to be a junior partner of China? That does not square up. Because if a proud people at one end are not willing to accept a particular status with one person, why would that proud people accept that status with someone else? That is one. Now that makes me sound as a great defender of Russia, but that is not the purpose of the exercise. For me, as an Indian, the reason I'm saying this is an independent, sovereign Russia is very important, because if there is a bipolarity that emerges, I will have to choose. I know what Indians will choose. I have no worries about that. I mean, I have no major issues with being, part of the greater firmament of the United States. That is not. I'm speaking in a language they understand. But my problem is about India's aspirations for great power, status. If I want to be at the table where they're writing the rules, then I need an independent Russia, because that will keep me independent from this bipolarity. So therefore, I definitely do not agree with Professor Happy Mohan Jacob, and I will definitely go back and tell him that I don't agree.
Okay. Well, if we don't have any more questions, let's thank Nandan for a great, well, it was not lecture, it was a great talk and discussion after it.